April 18, 1945. The small town of Thüringen, Germany, lay under a blanket of mist as dawn broke over the rolling hills. A convoy of 3 American military trucks rumbled down the cobblestone streets, their engines echoing against the ancient buildings. Inside the lead vehicle, Sergeant Thomas Harmon of the United States Army sat straight-backed, watching the empty streets with wary eyes. He believed that within days, the temporary prisoner processing center his unit had been assigned to would be disbanded, and he would finally be heading home to Missouri. The war in Europe was all but won. Little did he know that his most significant battle was about to begin. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one American soldier's chance encounter with a young female prisoner would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, courage, and what it truly means to be on the right side of history. The morning air was crisp as Sergeant Harmon stepped out of the truck and surveyed the makeshift processing facility. The Americans had requisitioned a former school building to temporarily house and process displaced persons and prisoners before they were transferred to more permanent facilities. The 3-story stone structure stood imposing against the brightening sky, its windows reflecting the early morning light. First Lieutenant Mills wants a full inspection before the new arrivals, Staff Sergeant Wilson called out, approaching with a clipboard in hand. Group coming in from the east at 0800 hours, mostly civilians picked up near Leipzig, but intelligence says there might be some persons of interest. Harmon nodded. At 26 years old, Thomas Harmon had already seen more than most men witness in a lifetime. The son of a carpenter from Springfield, Missouri, he had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. After 3 years of fighting across North Africa and Europe, his brown hair had begun to gray at the temples, and permanent lines had formed at the corners of his blue eyes. "How many personnel do we have on duty?" Harmon asked, walking alongside Wilson toward the entrance. 24 guards, 3 officers, and 8 administrative staff, Wilson replied. "Should be more than adequate for the 40 or so coming in today." Inside the building, the Americans had converted classrooms into processing rooms, offices, and temporary holding areas. The gymnasium served as the main housing space, with separate sections for men and women cordoned off with hastily erected wooden partitions. While Spartan, the facility was clean and organized, a testament to American efficiency. At precisely 800 hours, the first transport trucks arrived. Harmon stood in the courtyard alongside First Lieutenant James Mills, a tall, thin man from Boston with a perpetual frown. The back doors of the first truck opened, and people began climbing down, civilians with haunted eyes, their clothes dirty and worn. "Remember, Sergeant," Mills said quietly, "our job is to process them, not judge them. Leave that to the intelligence boys." A group of 6 guards directed the arrivals toward the main entrance, where they would be registered, searched, and assigned temporary identification. Harmon watched carefully, looking for any signs of trouble. The second truck contained more of the same, tired, hungry-looking civilians. But as the third truck opened, Harmon noticed something different. Among the group was a young woman who stood apart from the rest. Unlike the dejected postures of the others, she held herself with dignity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and despite her threadbare dress, she carried herself with a grace that immediately caught his attention. "Who's that?" Harmon asked Staff Sergeant Wilson, who was checking names against a manifest. Wilson glanced up. "Elena Bartov, 24 years old, picked up near Leipzig with no identification. Says she's Russian, but won't say much else. Intelligence has her flagged for further questioning." Harmon watched as Elena Bartov was led inside with the others. Something about her story didn't add up. Russians were allies, not detainees. Why was she here? Later that afternoon, Harmon was reviewing supply requisitions when Lieutenant Mills appeared at his door. "Sergeant Harmon, I need you to oversee the initial questioning of some of the detainees. Intelligence is sending someone tomorrow, but we need to get preliminary information today." "Yes, sir," Harmon replied, setting aside his paperwork. Among the 5 detainees Harmon was assigned to question was Elena Bartov. She sat across from him in a small room that had once been a teacher's office, her hands folded neatly on the table between them. Up close, Harmon could see that her eyes were a striking green, contrasting with her dark hair. Miss Bartow, Harmon began, consulting the file before him. I need to ask you a few questions about your identity and how you came to be in Leipzig. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I have already told this to the others. I am from Stalingrad. I was taken to Germany as a worker in 1943. Her English was good but heavily accented. Harmon noted this in the file. And your occupation before the war? I was a student. Engineering. Harmon raised an eyebrow. Engineering? That's unusual for a woman, even in Russia. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Pride, perhaps. In my country, women build things too, Sergeant. Harmon continued with standard questions about her journey, her time in Germany, and whether she had any knowledge of military movements or personnel. Throughout the questioning, he had the distinct impression she was holding back, measuring each answer carefully. Miss Bartow, he said finally, closing the file, I should inform you that an intelligence officer will be arriving tomorrow for further questioning. It would be better for you to be forthcoming now. Elena's expression didn't change. I have told you the truth, Sergeant. As Harmon escorted her back to the women's section of the gymnasium, he found himself troubled. Her story was plausible, yet incomplete. Thousands of Russians had been brought to Germany as forced labor, but something about Elena Bartow suggested there was more to her history. That evening, Harmon was making his final rounds when he passed the gymnasium. Most of the detainees were already asleep on their cots, but through the doorway he spotted Elena sitting alone, writing in a small notebook. Lights out in 10 minutes. Miss Bartow, he said, pausing at the entrance. She looked up, quickly closing the notebook. Yes, Sergeant. What are you writing? Just thoughts, memories. She hesitated, then added, So I do not forget. Harmon nodded and continued his rounds, but the image of Elena writing by the dim light stayed with him. She didn't fit his mental picture of a Russian laborer. Her bearing, her education, her careful speech, all suggested someone of significance. The next morning brought clear skies and the promised intelligence officer, Captain David Reynolds, a sharp-faced man with cold eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. Harmon briefed him on the detainees, including Elena Bartow. Bartow, Reynolds repeated, scanning the file. That name sounds familiar. After the briefing, Reynolds began his interviews. Harmon returned to his administrative duties, but throughout the morning he found himself distracted, wondering about Reynolds' questioning methods. The captain had a reputation for getting results, sometimes through means Harmon preferred not to contemplate. Shortly after noon, Harmon was summoned to Reynolds's temporary office. Sergeant Harmon, Reynolds said, not looking up from the files spread before him. You interviewed the Russian woman, Bartow. Yes, sir. Did she mention any connection to Professor Mikhail Bartow? Harmon frowned. No, sir. She said very little about her family. Reynolds finally looked up, his expression triumphant. Mikhail Bartow is one of Russia's leading physicists. He was working on weapons research before the Germans invaded. Elena Bartow is his daughter. Harmon felt a chill. Sir, if she's the daughter of a Soviet scientist, why is she being detained? The Russians are our allies. Reynolds' smile didn't reach his eyes. Allies for now, Sergeant, but the war is ending and the future is already being shaped. If the Soviets have advanced weapons technology, we need to know about it. He closed the file. I'll be taking over her questioning personally. She'll be transferred to a secure facility tomorrow. Harmon hesitated. Sir, she claims she was brought to Germany as forced labor. Perhaps, Reynolds conceded, or perhaps she was collaborating. Either way, she knows things that could be valuable. He fixed Harmon with a stern look. This is above your pay grade, Sergeant. Focus on your duties. Yes, sir. Throughout the afternoon, Harmon struggled to concentrate on his work. He had seen enough in this war to know that secure facilities and specialized questioning could mean many things, few of them good, even when conducted by his own side. At 1600 hours, Harmon was passing the room where Reynolds was conducting interviews when he heard raised voices. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see Reynolds standing over Eleanor, his face flushed with anger. Your father's work could save American lives or cost them, Reynolds was saying. Cooperation now will be remembered favorably. Elena's voice was steady but strained. I have told you I know nothing of my father's work. I am an engineering student, not a physicist. You expect me to believe the daughter of Mikhail Bartov knows nothing? Reynolds slammed his hand on the table. Your father's research on atomic structure was years ahead of Western science. The Germans wanted it. Now we want it. Harman moved on before he could be noticed, but the exchange troubled him deeply. Elena was being treated not as a victim of German aggression, but as an asset to be exploited. And from the sounds of it, Reynolds' questioning was only going to intensify. That night, Harman couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the officers' quarters, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events. The war had presented many moral challenges, but always before the lines had seemed clear. Now he wasn't so certain. At 0200 hours, Harman gave up on sleep and decided to check the facility. As he approached the room where Elena was being held separately from the other detainees, he heard muffled sounds from within. Opening the door, he found Elena huddled in a corner, her face bruised, her lip bleeding. What happened? Harman demanded, though he already suspected. Elena looked up, her eyes defiant despite her condition. Your Captain Reynolds is very thorough in his questioning. Harman felt sick. This isn't right. I'll report this to Lieutenant Mills. It will make no difference. Elena wiped blood from her lip. I am not a person to them. I am information to be extracted. Harman knew she was right. Mills would defer to Reynolds, and Reynolds answered to authorities far above their pay grades. In the new world taking shape as the war ended, Elena Bartov was a piece in a larger game, a game Harman wanted no part of. I'll bring you some water and something for those bruises, he said, his decision already forming. As Harman made his way to the supply room, he passed the facility's small communications office. Through the window he could see the radio operator, dozing at his post. On impulse, Harman entered, startling the young corporal awake. At ease, Harman said. I need to check something in the logs. While the corporal stepped outside for a cigarette, Harman quickly scanned the transmission log. As he suspected, Reynolds had sent a message to headquarters requesting transport for a high-value intelligence asset the following day at 1000 hours. Returning to Elena with water, bandages and a cold compress, Harman found her sitting on her cot, composing herself. Thank you, she said as he handed her the supplies. You are different from the others. Harman sat across from her. Tell me the truth. Are you really Mikhail Bartov's daughter? Elena was silent for a long moment, studying Harman's face as if judging whether he could be trusted. Finally, she nodded. Yes, but I have not seen my father since 1941, when Stalingrad was evacuated. The university moved east beyond the Urals. My father went with them. I stayed to help with the defense. How did you end up in Germany? Elena's eyes grew distant. I was captured during the fighting. When they discovered my name, I was sent to Germany for questioning about my father's work. But I told them the truth. I know nothing of it. My studies were in structural engineering, not physics. And they didn't believe you. No, they did not. She looked directly at Harman. Just as your Captain Reynolds does not. Harman made his decision. They're transferring you tomorrow to a special facility for further questioning. Fear flickered across Elena's face before she controlled it. I see. I can help you, Harman said quietly, hardly believing the words as he spoke them. But we would need to leave tonight. Elena stared at him in disbelief. Why would you risk this for me? Harman considered the question. Why indeed? He had a spotless service record, a promising future. What he was contemplating would end all that, possibly land him in prison. Yet the alternative, standing by while Elena was subjected to enhanced questioning for information she didn't possess, was unthinkable. Because this isn't what I fought for, he said finally. This war was supposed to end oppression, not extend it with different faces. The plan Harman devised was simple out of necessity. The facility maintained 3 jeeps for official use. At 0400 hours, during the shift change when attention would be divided, he would escort Elena to one of the vehicles under the pretense of an authorized transfer. They would have a 6-hour head start before Reynolds discovered them missing. Where will we go? Elena asked as Harman explained the plan. West, into the American zone, then south towards Switzerland. I have a contact in military intelligence who might help us get across the border. He didn't mention that the contact was a former classmate he hadn't spoken to in years, whose willingness to help was far from certain. At 03:45 hours, Harmon returned to Elena's room with an American military jacket and cap. "Put these on," he instructed. "Keep your head down and follow my lead. If anyone questions us, I'll say you're a translator being taken to assist with an interrogation in Frankfurt." Elena changed quickly, tucking her dark hair up into the cap. The jacket hung loosely on her slender frame, but in the pre-dawn darkness, the disguise might pass casual inspection. As they moved through the quiet hallways, Harmon's heart pounded so loudly he was sure others must hear it. They passed 2 guards who nodded respectfully at his sergeant's stripes without looking closely at his companion. In the motor pool, a sleepy corporal looked up from his logbook. "Bit early for a drive, Sergeant." "Special assignment from Captain Reynolds," Harmon replied, projecting confidence he didn't feel. "Need to get this translator to Frankfurt for an urgent interrogation." The corporal yawned. "Sign here." Harmon scrawled his signature, trying to keep his hand steady, and took the keys to a jeep. Minutes later, they were passing through the main gate, Harmon returning the sentry's salute with practiced ease, while Eleanor kept her head down beside him. As they drove through the sleeping town and into the countryside, the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky. Eleanor sat silently beside him, her face tense but determined. "We'll need to avoid main roads and checkpoints," Harmon said, turning onto a narrow country lane. "It will take longer, but it's safer." Elena nodded. "I understand." After a pause, she added, "Thank you, Sergeant Harmon. I know what this costs you." "Thomas," he corrected, "I think we're past ranks now." By mid-morning, they had traveled nearly 80 miles on back roads, stopping only once to refuel from a can Harmon had loaded before departure. They avoided villages where possible, taking farm tracks and forest paths where the jeep could manage the terrain. "We should reach the Rhine by nightfall," Harmon said, checking his map during a brief stop. "I know a place where we might cross without attracting attention." Eleanor studied his profile. "You have done this before? Helped people escape?" Harmon shook his head. "Never. But I spent 3 months in this region last winter. I know the territory." He folded the map. "How much do you remember about Switzerland? Could you find your way to the Soviet embassy in Bern?" "I think so. I studied in Geneva for a semester before the war." She hesitated. "Thomas, you do not need to come with me across the border. You have risked enough already." Harmon started the jeep again. "Let's get to the Rhine first, then we'll decide." As the day progressed, they began to encounter more traffic: American military vehicles, civilian trucks returning to towns and villages, and the endless stream of displaced persons heading west. Harmon avoided direct routes, but couldn't escape all contact. At one checkpoint, a military police officer studied their papers longer than comfortable before waving them through. "That was close," Harmon muttered as they drove away. "He's going to remember us when the alert goes out." "How much farther?" Eleanor asked, tension evident in her voice. "Another 30 miles to the crossing point." They drove in silence for several miles, both lost in thought. Harmon wondered what would happen to Elena once she reached Switzerland. Would she be able to return to Russia? Would she be welcomed as a hero or suspected as a collaborator? The Soviets were not known for their understanding. "Tell me about your home," he said suddenly, wanting to break the silence and distract them both from their precarious situation. Elena smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Stalingrad was beautiful before the war. We lived near the university, in an apartment overlooking the Volga. In spring, the river would flood, and from our windows, it looked like an inland sea." "Do you think you'll go back there?" Her smile faded. "There is nothing left to go back to. The fighting destroyed everything." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Where is your home?" "Springfield, Missouri. Not as dramatic as the Volga, but we have the Ozark Mountains nearby. My father builds furniture, oak mostly, some walnut. I was apprenticed to him before the war." "You will return to this, building furniture?" Harmon's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That was the plan. Now, I don't know." They fell silent again, the implications of Harmon's actions hanging between them. Even if he successfully delivered Elena to safety, his own future was uncertain at best. Desertion in wartime, theft of military property, aiding a foreign national, the charges would be severe. Late in the afternoon, as they approached a small farming village, Harmon spotted military vehicles ahead, several jeeps and a transport truck parked across the road. Military police were checking all passing vehicles. "That's not a routine checkpoint," Harmon said, slowing the jeep. "They're looking for someone." Eleanor tensed beside him. "For us." Harmon made a quick decision, turning off onto a dirt track that led away from the village. "We'll circle around. There's another route, but it will add hours to our journey." The detour took them through dense forest on barely passable trails. Twice they had to clear fallen branches from their path. By the time they emerged onto a proper road again, the sun was setting, and they were still 20 miles from the Rhine crossing. "We need to find somewhere to stop for the night," Harmon said, noting Elena's exhaustion. Continuing in darkness is too risky. They found shelter in an abandoned barn several hundred yards from the road. Harmon concealed the jeep as best he could with branches and old tarps found inside. Using his field kit, he prepared a meager meal of K-rations and shared his canteen of water. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Eleanor wrapped herself tighter in the military jacket, trying not to shiver. "Here," Harmon said, offering his blanket. "Take this. Then you will be cold." "I've slept in worse conditions." They sat side by side against a wall of the barn, listening to the distant sounds of vehicles on the road and the closer rustle of wildlife in the surrounding fields. "Why did you become a soldier?" Elena asked after a long silence. "Pearl Harbor," Harmon replied, "like a lot of Americans. One day I was working in my father's shop. The next I was volunteering at the recruitment office." He paused, remembering. It seemed so clear then. Good versus evil. Now. He trailed off. "Now you see that it is not so simple," Elena finished for him. "No, it's not." Harmon stared into the darkness. "Don't misunderstand. The Germans committed terrible atrocities. That part is clear enough. But the way this war is ending, with everyone scrambling for advantage in whatever comes next, that's harder to reconcile." "Power fills vacuums," Elena said quietly. "My father used to say this. When Germany falls, there will be a very large vacuum." Harmon nodded, understanding all too well. Elena's father, and by extension Elena herself, represented knowledge that both the Americans and Soviets wanted to control. The war against fascism was ending, but another conflict was already taking shape. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "We'll leave at first light." Despite his advice, Harmon remained awake most of the night, listening for any sign of pursuit. Helena slept fitfully beside him, occasionally murmuring words in Russian that he couldn't understand. Dawn brought a heavy mist that blanketed the landscape, providing welcome cover as they resumed their journey. Harmon felt the weight of fatigue as he drove, his eyes constantly scanning for checkpoints or patrols. "There's a map in my jacket pocket," he told Elena. "Can you navigate? We need to reach this point on the Rhine." He indicated a small marking he had made the previous day. Elena studied the map carefully. "There is a road here that goes directly to the river. Too obvious. We'll take this route instead." He traced a winding path through smaller villages. "It's longer but less likely to be watched." As the morning progressed, they began to encounter more evidence of the war's destructive path: bombed buildings, burned-out vehicles, and fields scarred by artillery. They passed through one village where the only inhabitants were old men and women who watched their passage with hollow eyes. "So much suffering," Elena said softly, "on all sides." Harmon didn't respond. What could he say? He had been part of the force that had brought destruction to these lands, however justified the cause. They were less than 10 miles from the Rhine when disaster struck. Rounding a bend on a country road, they found themselves face to face with an American patrol, 2 jeeps carrying military police. Harmon reacted instantly, swerving off the road and accelerating across an open field toward a distant line of trees. Behind them, shouts and the sound of engines revving indicated pursuit. "Hold on!" he yelled, as the jeep bounced violently over the uneven ground. Elena gripped the seat with white knuckles, her face pale but determined. They reached the trees seconds ahead of their pursuers, plunging into the dense forest where the larger patrol vehicles would struggle to follow. Harmon navigated by instinct, avoiding the thickest growth, dodging between trunks, and praying they wouldn't hit an obstacle that would end their flight. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Harmon knew it was temporary. The patrol would radio ahead, setting up a perimeter. Their best chance now was to abandon the jeep and continue on foot. After several more minutes of harrowing driving, Harmon brought the vehicle to a stop in a small clearing. "We need to continue on foot from here. The jeep is too easy to spot." They gathered what supplies they could carry, water, remaining rations, Harmon's compass and map, and set out through the forest. Harmon set a brisk pace, aware that time was working against them. "The Rhine is approximately 5 miles in that direction," he said, pointing. "If we can reach it by nightfall, we might find a boat or a place to swim across." Elena nodded, keeping pace despite her fatigue. They walked in silence, saving their breath for the journey, stopping only briefly for water and to check their direction. The sound of aircraft overhead sent them diving for cover beneath the trees several times. Once, they heard voices and froze in place until a patrol passed within 50 yards of their position without spotting them. Late in the afternoon, they reached the edge of the forest. Before them stretched several hundred yards of open farmland, and beyond that, the silvery ribbon of the Rhine. "We'll wait until dark," Harmon decided, studying the terrain through his field glasses. "There's a small dock down there with a few boats tied up. If we're lucky, we can borrow one without being noticed." They rested among the trees, conserving their strength for the final push. As the sun began to set, Eleanor touched Harmon's arm. "Thomas," she said softly, "whatever happens, I want you to know that what you have done, it matters. Not just to me, but to the idea of what your country stands for." Harmon felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm not sure I know what that is anymore." "I do," Eleanor said with certainty. "It is the belief that principles are more important than power, that justice applies even when it is inconvenient." She held his gaze. "Not everyone would have made the choice you did." Darkness fell, and with it came their opportunity. Moving as silently as possible, they crossed the open ground, crouching low and using every available shadow. The dock Harmon had spotted was deserted, with 3 small rowboats secured to it. "Take this," Harmon said, handing Elena his jacket. "The nights are cold on the water." "You are not coming?" Eleanor asked, though her expression suggested she had expected this. Harmon shook his head. "One person in a small boat attracts less attention than 2. Besides, my presence in Switzerland would only complicate your situation." He helped her into the boat and handed her the oars. "Stay close to the far shore and land before dawn. The Swiss border is less than 10 miles downriver." Elena gripped his hand. "What will happen to you? I'll figure something out." Harmon managed a smile he didn't feel. "Maybe I'll claim I was kidnapped by a Russian spy." "Thomas, go," he urged, untying the rope, "before someone comes." Eleanor hesitated, then leaned forward and kissed him briefly. "Find me in Geneva, when this is all over." Harmon pushed the boat away from the dock, watching as Elena began to row steadily across the dark water. He stood watching until she was swallowed by the night, a strange mixture of loss and accomplishment washing over him. He had just turned to begin his own uncertain journey, when lights appeared on the road behind him and vehicles approached at speed. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide on the open dock. Harmon straightened his shoulders and waited. The leading jeep pulled to a stop, headlights illuminating him in their glare. A familiar figure stepped out, Captain Reynolds. "Sergeant Harmon," Reynolds said, approaching with 2 military police flanking him, "you've led us on quite a chase." "Yes, sir," Harmon replied, standing at attention out of ingrained habit. Reynolds looked past him to the river. "Where is she?" "Gone, sir." Reynolds' face hardened. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The intelligence we could have gained?" "She didn't know anything about her father's work," Harmon interrupted. "She was an engineering student, not a physicist." "That wasn't your determination to make," Reynolds snapped. "You've committed treason, Sergeant. Aiding a foreign agent, desertion under fire." "The war is over, sir," Harmon said quietly. "Germany has all but surrendered. There is no under fire anymore." Reynolds studied him with cold eyes. "The war may be ending, Harmon, but the next one is already beginning, and you've just handed the Soviets an advantage." Harman didn't respond. He knew nothing he could say would change Reynolds' mind or his own fate. The military police stepped forward, and Harman offered his wrists for the handcuffs without resistance. As they led him to the waiting jeep, he glanced back at the Rhine. Somewhere on that dark water, Eleanor was rowing toward freedom, toward a future that might include peace, if men like Reynolds didn't prevail. 4 months later, Sergeant Thomas Harman stood before a military tribunal in Frankfurt. The charges against him had been reduced from treason to dereliction of duty and misappropriation of military property. Serious, but not capital offenses. His attorney, a sympathetic major from the Judge Advocate General's office, had argued successfully that the incident occurred during the confused final days of the European conflict. The sentence was still severe: dishonorable discharge and 5 years imprisonment. As the guards led him from the courtroom, Harman felt no regret. Elena had made it safely to Switzerland. He had learned this through discreet inquiries by his attorney. From there, she had eventually returned to Russia, though whether she found welcome or suspicion he did not know. In his cell that night, Harman received an unexpected visitor, Lieutenant Mills, his former commanding officer. "Thought you should know," Mills said without preamble. "Reynolds has been reassigned, something in Washington, very hush-hush." He studied Harman through the bars. "They're saying your 5 years might be reduced. Good behavior, overcrowding, that sort of thing." Harman nodded, uncertain why Mills was telling him this. "There's something else." Mills lowered his voice. "That Russian girl's father. Turns out he died during the siege of Leningrad, 2 years ago. Whatever Reynolds thought she knew died with him." The revelation hit Harman like a physical blow. Elena had been pursued, threatened, and nearly imprisoned for information that no longer existed, information she had truthfully claimed not to possess. "Why are you telling me this?" Harman asked. Mills shrugged. "Thought you should know your sacrifice wasn't entirely wasted." He turned to go, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Wrong way, but right thing." After Mills left, Harman sat on his bunk for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences. He had lost his career, his freedom, and his place in society for a principle. Was it worth it? He remembered Elena's words at the river: "Principles are more important than power." In a world rebuilding itself from the ashes of war, perhaps that belief was worth preserving, whatever the cost. 2 years later, Thomas Harman was indeed released early. He returned to Springfield, to his father's woodworking shop, to a life both familiar and forever changed. The war had taught him about courage in battle, but Elena had taught him about courage in peace, the harder, quieter courage of standing by one's principles when doing so carries a heavy price. He never saw Elena again, but occasionally news from behind what was now called the Iron Curtain would mention advances in Soviet structural engineering. He liked to think she had found her way back to her true passion, building things that would last beyond conflicts and ideologies. In 1967, during the height of the Cold War, Harman received a package from Switzerland. Inside was a small wooden box of exquisite craftsmanship. The note accompanying it read simply, "Some principles endure even when separated by oceans and ideologies. E." The box now sits on Thomas Harman's workbench, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, individual acts of conscience can illuminate the path forward, not just for those directly involved, but for all who hear their story and are inspired to make similar choices when faced with their own moral crossroads. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.